Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've had a great day so far. Before we get started, I'm just going to allow, say, 30 seconds or so to allow everyone a chance to join via Zoom. But as you can see, so this evening we have our West Midlands Virtual Branch Masterclass, and we hope you enjoy it. So this one will be on new browser standards, DNS over HTTPS and encrypted hello. I'll shortly hand over to our host this evening, but before we do make a start, I'm going to run you through our house rules that we have for all of our webinars. So as it says there, you will be muted throughout the webinar this evening, but there will be plenty of chances to ask our speakers some questions. So do type those through to us using the Q&A box here on Zoom, and our host will be able to ask those at the most appropriate time. So that's great. And then if you have any issues today, hopefully you don't, but if you do, then please bring it to our attention either via the raise hand icon or by emailing us at support@CIISec.org, and another member of the team will be able to help you with that. So hopefully you've all got your drink and you're ready to start. Now I'm going to hand you over to our host this evening, who is Richard Cornell. Richard is our CIISec branch chair for the West Midlands branch. And as well as that, he's also the IT security manager at the Canal and River Trust. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Richard, to get us started.
Thank you very much. And welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again, to be able to do another West Midlands virtual branch meeting. You never know, at some point we might be able to have a face-to-face meeting. We're in a hybrid world at the moment, I think it's fair to say. An interesting topic this evening, one that I've been following closely in the tech press over the last year or so. It has some important implications for all of us, I think. If you're interested in privacy and security, which I'm sure you are, otherwise you won't be here today, but also if you're responsible for managing the security of an organization, this has some significant impacts. So before we start, I'd just like to take the opportunity to just talk about a couple of things that are coming up that you may or may not have been made aware of. So we have some CIISec events coming up in October. So we've got quite a busy schedule, as you can see. A couple of diversity and inclusion webinars. So it's really nice to be able to see those and to join in the work that's been going on across the CIISec community in terms of diversity and inclusion. We've also got the second part of the XDR Masterclass, so that should be quite an interesting talk. And also we've got the innovation webinar coming up at the end of October. As you'll see, we've also got a number of other events that are going on in the community which are supported by CIISec in some shape or form. So head over to the CIISec website or their page on LinkedIn if you want to sign up for one of those. So I encourage you to do so. So as I say, today's talk is about DNS over HTTPS and encrypted hello. So it's nice to have a former colleague of mine, Paul Breers, who's here to talk about these things. So hopefully it'll be a deep dive into the technology and also a chance to discuss some of the issues that these potentially create. So I'll hand over to Paul, who will be able to introduce himself, and I look forward to asking him some interesting questions at the end. So if you do have any questions as we go along, then do please put them in the Q&A box available. So I shall stop sharing and hand over to Paul.
Okay, hopefully I'm now sharing and people can see the right screen. Yes, what I'm talking about tonight. So I'm talking about these two new standards. So one that changes how DNS works and one that changes how HTTPS works. And so we're going to look at how these work and what they mean. And it's not quite a clear-cut thing. There are some good points and some bad points about this, and the bad points we just have to learn how to live with them, because they are happening, whether we like it or not. So who am I? I've spent sort of 20 years working in a security role at an ISP, providing filtering, and so worrying about how these standards work or how they used to work. And I currently work for Nominet Cyber, helping on their protective DNS service, is service to the public sector. Let's first look at why change. So I don't know if everyone remembers kind of the Edward Snowden revelations from a few years ago, where it became apparent that the United States government and various other governments were slurping significantly more information than I think people had realized. And you saw people protesting, hands off my metadata. The metadata not being that they could reveal the entire conversation, but they know who you've spoken to, when you spoke to them, and that metadata is valuable even if the actual communications are encrypted. And so it's that metadata that people have been looking at how to protect better. So let's think about who's making some of these changes and who's making these standards. So lots of people will have seen at various times RFCs being published, and it's this Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, which are responsible for these. These are the standards that then operating systems and browser manufacturers and server vendors are then implementing, so that that DNS as done by Windows 11 will talk to that bind server over there and be able to get results, and they're both operating off the same standards. So the RFC papers are created by kind of groups of key internet players, and you see them on the papers often listed as their individual rather than necessarily their company. So it won't necessarily say somebody's Apple necessarily. It might show them as working for a different organization, but really you have to look and work out who the person actually works for if they've put their private address on there. And so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to work out who's pushing the standards, but you can normally do some working on it. And the standards go from varying forms as they get adopted, and there's a working group where they get refined and triannual meetings, and there are various other people within the steering group and the architecture board who are saying the direction. But it's the working group who are doing the heavy lifting of writing these standards. And they'll have a broad spread of people on that working group, and anyone can go and listen in and join. These meetings are open, but what you will find is that the kind of people that are in it tend to be dominated by people at network equipment vendors, operating system vendors, browser vendors, big cloud providers. What you're not seeing is people who are representing corporate IT security in small organizations or even large enterprises. So there's some people missing in that room when these standards are being debated, and I think you'll see why that matters later on. So, example of RFCs. So just because it's an RFC, it doesn't necessarily mean implemented. There's joke ones like TCP/IP over carrier pigeons published on April the 1st, and there's other ones which are again for other reasons jokes. So you have to be kind of careful looking at these and working out whether something's real. Just because it's an RFC doesn't necessarily mean it's real. Equally, there's things like one I'm showing above, the RPZ policy zone, which is implemented in loads of vendors. Loads of people use these every day, yet the standard is a draft expired one because nobody in the working group wanted to adopt it. However, it's adopted by Bind, it's adopted by Power DNS, Infoblox, and all sorts of DNS vendors, and lots of people use it. The status codes one underneath is another example where, in the other extreme, it gets adopted, but actually there's some stuff in some of those status codes that you'll never see used, like 511 network authentication required for captive portals, which is not actually how a captive portal works these days. So the standard was written with the best of intentions, but it was never actually implemented by the captive portal or the browsers. And so it's kind of a dead standard. So yeah, you kind of have to look at these carefully and work out what's real. Anyway, on to DNS. So the original standards for DNS written a long time ago. So 1987 was when the current kind of UDP DNS standard was adopted. So the internet looked very, very different in 1987. As an example, this is another computer that was launched in 1987, the first ARM processor in a microcomputer. Long time ago, very different world, and that's why this stuff needs to be updated. It isn't fit for purpose anymore. So how does DNS work today using the traditional DNS? And just covering this in case there'll be some people who've haven't played with this as much. So you've got your user in front of a browser that's talking to an operating system, and it's the operating system that's then doing the work, probably talking to a forwarder, which might be maybe your box in your house provided by BT or whoever, talking to a bigger box, the recursive resolver run by your ISP, which then goes off and talks to root servers, TLD servers, and the authoritative servers, and gets the answer back of where does example.uk live. So that bit in the middle, the ISP or corporate network, that has access to see who the client was that was doing the lookup and what they looked up. So it's got some privileged information there. In general, things like Active Directory don't actually record that, and most ISPs don't record it. But there is a concern that they could do, and it is definitely in the clear as it goes past their network. And who could have tapped their network and what else is going on. And that's why people want to encrypt this data. So let's look at that, how that looks on the wire. You can see again, this is it's a binary standard, but as soon as you put something like Wireshark there that understands how to decode those binary messages, you can see very clearly in the clear what you were looking up and what the answer was. So so that's why it's so easy to decode these messages. One of the things that you'll see with the traditional standards, how does the workstation know where to send those DNS requests? The workstation got its IP address probably from DHCP when it was powered up, and DHCP will have also given the operating system what the IP address of a DNS server is. This could have been statically configured, but normally it's DHCP. And this is one of the things that differs with the new DOH standard. And in your office, this might be your Active Directory server that you're getting the answer from DHCP for, or at home, it'd be your ISP router that's doing DHCP and probably giving itself as the address that you get. In both cases, this is likely to be a private address you've got back. And again, that's important when we come to look at some stuff later on. But you could choose to get DHCP to send out a public address like Quad 8, Quad 1, Quad 9, but normally it's your initial one's private, and then it's chained up to something that's on one of those public resolvers. So what else is DNS being used for today? So there are lots of things that are now being using DNS that were not envisaged in 1987 when these standards were written. So split horizon DNS, most corporate networks make some use of this, where there's certain resources available by DNS internally that you don't want to make externally. And obviously that only works if you're talking to a DNS server that's inside your network. Active Directory does this lots. It saves records into the DNS as well when you do workstation registrations and things, and looks for server records and stuff. Out on the internet, content delivery networks know to send you to the right. When you go to YouTube, Google knows to send you to the YouTube cache that's closest to you by using DNS as one of the clues. Your ISP might be doing parental filtering, or in your corporate network, you might be doing filtering to stop people going to bad sites in the office. And that often in a lightweight way will be using DNS. In your corporate network, you might be using proxies and deep packet inspection, but at home, it's quite likely on your BT Home Hub or your Virgin one to be using DNS to do that, because it's light and it's easy to set up. And the bad guys are also using DNS as well. So there are lots of kits to do data exfiltration or command and control for your Trojan, how to get instructions down to your client, but use DNS, because DNS is always there. However locked down that workstation is, there's a pretty reasonable chance that DNS will be allowed through the network. So if you've got your rootkit onto that box, then DNS might be one of the things it uses to talk out. And at the moment, that will go through your normal DNS server in your corporate network, and maybe if you've got the right seam, then you might know that somebody's got that going on, because you can look for the unusual packets and you can work out what's going on. But obviously, if that's no longer going through your corporate network, life gets a bit more interesting. So what are the problems with traditional DNS? So we've kind of talked about this already, but confidentiality is a big one. It's plain text. Lots of people, including your ISP, have a complete list of the history of the sites you visited. They might not be keeping their history, but they have the capability of collecting it. Integrity, it's all, again, unencrypted and can be easily manipulated by an attacker. There's various kind of attacks if you're on the local network, on shared Wi-Fi, to spoof DNS messages and cause people to go to sites when they weren't intending to. And the other one is, obviously, there are lots of availability issues. DNS, classically, these big outages often happen because there are problems with DNS. So when DNS goes wrong, it goes wrong spectacularly because everything stops working. And yeah, a classic joke. Everyone says it's not DNS. Oh, it was DNS. And Azure's had outages where they've managed to take out part of Azure, and it turns out to be they've stopped publishing the DNS records of where their SQL server was. So lots of people have seen DNSSec. So doesn't that help? So DNS security extensions, these are quite old RFCs and have been adopted and updated over the years. They're about ensuring the integrity of results from that authoritative server down to the recursive. So that bottom part of that message, it doesn't really do very much between your client and the recursive resolver. You can ask the recursive resolver to validate the requests for you, but you're still trusting the recursive resolver to do that. You can ask the client to do it, but that doesn't happen. But very few operating systems support or have the client checking enabled. And what you see for DNSSec is some extra records that the authoritative server publishes for signatures. And then when you do your DNS lookup, it goes and looks up you see the do bit saying, I'd like you to do the request, please, recursive resolver. And the recursive resolver goes and gets the signature and checks the signature and then sends the answer back. So what you can see from those network traces is that's still very much in the clear. While we've got integrity checking going on and we've got some signatures, the person on the wire looking knows exactly what you've looked it up. It hasn't helped with confidentiality at all. And it doesn't really help with integrity between your client and the ISP. It's only helping between the ISP and the authoritative server. And if you think about your threat model, actually, that's probably not your problem. Your problem is probably local, not between the recursive resolver and the authoritative. So DNSSec adoption isn't very well adopted. It requires the person running the zone to put extra work in to sign zones. If they get that wrong, they take their zone off the internet and nobody can send a mail and nobody can look at their website. And so corporate IT people tend not to bother to turn it on as a result, because frankly, it's a lot of risk if it goes wrong, and it's not very much gain for them for turning it on. And so the percentage of sites running it is quite low. And that includes people you think might have more of an interest in this, like banking sites. Again, if you look for, all the high street banks, very few of them have got it turned on the sites that they use for online banking. So it's got a triflingly small amount of adoption. But, most of the software supports it. You can turn it on, but most ISPs have chosen to turn it off because, again, they get the phone calls if this goes wrong. And somebody else outside of their network has screwed up their signing, and nobody on their ISP can see it. So lots of ISPs choose not to enable it. So how else have people thought about solving this problem? So there's a standard that I won't talk about called DNSCrypt, which was done kind of first, and it actually does have some adoption, but wasn't a formalized standard. So DOT was the first kind of recent attempt at doing a formalized standard using kind of modern TLS. So there's some RFCs for this. It's on a discrete port. So it's on a brand new port, TCP 853. It's the only thing on that port. This means it's easy to block. So if you have that blocked on your firewall, DOT's not coming through your firewall. Nice and straightforward. It can either work in an opportunistic way, where it will talk to the DNS server it's being configured with over UDP 53 and go, do you happen to speak DOT? And then if it does, it moves over and tries DOT. Or you can configure it out of band and put a key pin profile on to say, this is the DOT server you're talking to. And unless you're running DNSSec over it, it's not really doing any extra validation of results. So this is purely about the confidentiality of that message between you and the DOT server. And Android 9 is a client that has dot support built in. So you'll see in their private DNS, it's described as in there. And if you set it to automatic, it does the opportunistic discover. In Tiramisu, they're actually going to start supporting the new version of DNS over HTTPS that we'll cover next. But yeah, since Android 9, they've had dot in there, and you will probably see on your corporate firewall, if you've got something blocking access to those internal DNS servers on 853, you'll probably see some clients trying to use it who are using Android and trying to do opportunistic upgrades. So that wasn't really getting the adoption that the people on the IETF wanted. They wanted something that was really going to move the dial and get much more people on secure DNS, and make it much harder for people to start blocking it, because if you're in China and you want to stop dot, it's really, really easy. So they wanted to make something that was going to be much more difficult to block. So they came up with DOH. So let's go back to how normal DNS works. You can see our operating resolver talking to our forwarder, talking to recursive resolver. DO, quite different. So we've got our browser, and our browser has bypassed the rest of the operating system, and it goes, aha, I know about our server, I know how to speak HTTPS. I'm just going to speak HTTPS to this cloud DNS provider over here that's outside of a company network. And then that does the regular recursive resolver job, just like the ISP one would have done. So that recursive resolver's still got access to see the client IP and the request, but it's now somebody else who has access to that data. Your corporate IT doesn't, unless that happens to be run from your corporate IT. It's most likely to have been run by somebody like Cloudflare, and in which case it's them that's got access to the data, and yet you as a network provider don't get to see it. And yeah, so this was a RFC, and the key thing is this changes that threat model. So don't trust the local network. So dot still kind of trusted the local network. It tried to do opportunistic upgrades. And this is very much aimed at not trusting the local network. And it's also intended to be used by the browser, because browsers understand how to speak HTTPS anyway. So this is just another HTTPS message. It's very easy for the browsers to implement this. And it's a standard kind of HTTP post and get message over that connection. And basically you append the binary DNS message you would have sent on a normal DNS message. You append that as a parameter to the regular HTTP message. And it requires a good HTTPS connection. So what do I mean by that? It means real certificates. So you need, if you're going to support DO, you need an actual certificate on the box that the browser trusts. It won't work with self-signed certificates unless you have gone on to the clients and told it to trust them. This becomes an issue when we come to think about what IP addresses and where the normal DNS servers are on your edge routers. You can't do this on an edge router. And it's hard to block completely because it's normal HTTPS. So how are you going to spot the difference between this and other HTTPS messages coming in and out of your network? It's really hard to block, and that's by design. That's not an accident. So what does this introduce? So we have this discovery problem. So how do we know what DO server we're going to talk to? Unless we're going to trust the local network to tell us what DO server we're going to talk to. And we'll see that the solutions to that have often involved some centralization risks, because we end up with big cloud providers instead of local networks. So how have some of the providers gone and implemented this? So Mozilla was the first people to implement this, and they did it by basically saying, I don't care what you've configured in your operating system. If you tick this box, I'm going to send all of your DNS traffic to Cloudflare. Do you trust Cloudflare? I don't know, but I'm going to send your traffic to them. And they backed off because of some stick that they got from that in the UK. But in America, this is the default. If you're running Mozilla, unless you've disabled this in America, it will start sending your DNS traffic to Cloudflare unless you've told it otherwise. And this UI screenshot that I've taken is a user level action. This is not an admin action. You do not need to be a workstation administrator to turn this on or turn this off. Your end user who's got permissions to run Firefox can do this. It's not a reconfigure the operating system thing. Chrome, they came along later, and and saw the stick that Firefox and Mozilla had got for sending the traffic to Cloudflare, and went, oh, do we want the same stick for sending it to Google? Okay, we don't really want to do that. So what they've said is, we'll upgrade your current provider if we know what it is. So if DHCP has sent you 111 or Quad 8, and we know that that's got a DOE equivalent, we're going to upgrade you to DOE automatically. If we don't know whether you've got DOE going on, we'll leave it as regular UDP 53. And so that's why, although Chrome have supported this for a while, it doesn't actually matter to most networks, because as we saw at the beginning, DHCP's probably sent out a private address in that initial DHCP message, you know, your home network or your ISP's network or your corporate network. And so it's unlikely the Chrome solution will trigger by default, because it won't do that upgrade unless you've explicitly chosen that provider. But the key thing is that they will only upgrade the current provider. They won't switch your providers around. You've got a drop down in there, and then you can configure yourself a different provider if you want to, but the default is not to do that. Again, that box is user configurable, so your teenagers at home can go and do this, and basically that bypasses your BT parental filters. If that's what you are hoping to stop them getting to YouTube with, it won't work anymore. And in here you've got a list of pre-configured providers, but you can go and put your own in there if you want to. Microsoft are going to do something very similar to Google, and so they're going to do the upgrade option, where they look at the provider you've got. They've got a hard-coded list and say, aha, Quad 1, that will be Cloudflare over there. I can see Quad 1, I'll go and use Cloudflare. Quad 8, that will be Google, I'll go and use Quad 8. And you've got various options. I think unencrypted only is default, but you can set it to encrypted with DNS over HTTPS, or encryption upgrade allowed, but you know, back off if you can't. So you've got various options in Windows 11, and it's not clear if this is also going to make it into the next version of Windows 10 as well, or if this will just be in Windows 11. Originally, it was in the previews for the autumn version of Windows 10, but it's not clear what's happening now. So that's DNS. So you can see that there's some things that have changed there, but actually they haven't quite moved as fast as some people would want, because there are some problems that we'll talk about in a bit about how we work out what DNS provider we're using. Let's look at HTTPS and look at what's been going on over there. So there's a standard called server name indicator or server name indication, which is quite an old standard, not anywhere near as old as DNS. This dates from when TLS 1.0 was introduced, or just a bit after it. It's in a separate RFC, and it's intended for hosting many sites on one IP address. We realized we were going to run out of IP address if every single website on the world had a different IP address, and the hosting providers were not offering SSL hosting unless it was stupidly expensive because of the extra effort of the IP addresses. So this standard was intended to overcome that problem and make it easy to do the hosting of websites on SSL, TLS. And basically it adds an extra plain text header in the negotiation that says, this is the server I'm kind of trying to get to. Can you give me the certificate for that server, please? Because prior to that point, it was, here's the IP address I'm coming to get to. Give me the certificate for that IP address. And so if you're doing multiple sites on the same IP address, you kind of need to have something else to give the server a clue. There was a lot of fuss when TLS 1.3 was introduced about encrypting some extra bits in the certificate exchange, but the SNI header was left untouched, despite some of the headlines we saw when TLS 1.3 came out. So what else do we use SNI for, apart from what the authors intended? So corporate firewalls use this for filtering on HTTPS. If you're doing transparent filtering, it's most likely to be using this if you're not setting a proxy explicitly. Deep packet inspection on your IPS is almost certainly using this as well. And we know it's being used by nation states for censorship and eavesdropping as well. So again, things not intended when the standard was written. And they're considered abuse by the people who are writing this standard. Which is why I've kind of considered them abuse, but lots of corporate networks will consider that part of their day job. And once DNS is encrypted, SNI becomes the last piece of plain text clue to the site being visited. And so this is why, you know, now we've got a DOH standard. Now the focus has changed to HTTPS SNI. it's still the source IP address, the IP address you're connecting to. But again, we'll see how Cloudflare and people like that will mitigate that risk. So example of nation states doing SNI filtering, South Korea do it for various sites that the government have decided to block and enforce the ISPs to block. It's also used in India to, again, block certain sites on certain ISPs. And I think certain UK ISPs, again, by court order, will be probably doing something similar as well. So this is kind of what the authors of these standards want to stop, basically, is make it hard for nation states to implement those kind of things. So how have they gone about it? It started off as something called Encrypted SNI and is now become Encrypted Client Hello. And as we said, the aim, remove that last piece of plain text, don't stick out. So we don't want it to be easy for the network to see that there's an interesting connection coming on and I should put more attention to looking at that connection. We want to just look like every other connection going through the network. And we want to prevent downgrade attacks to stop somebody from tricking the client into requesting the site without this extra protection and revealing the address that they're going to. And it's really intended to be used with large scale services like Cloudflare so that you can't block the provider and you don't know who else Cloudflare have got on that IP address. You might be thinking you're blocking Playboy and you actually find that something else important like a government website is on that same IP address because they just happen to be another Cloudflare customer. So the aim of Cloudflare is to make it hard to block by IP. So why has it taken so long to do this? Why is it hard? So we need to send the server a clue before we've negotiated the TLS keys. So we've got nothing to encrypt the data with. We've got CDNs that serve thousands of websites. They have to know what certificate to send back. We want to not stick out, and we want to still support middle boxes and not make a standard that causes loads of people network appliances built ages ago and unpatched start crashing. And these middle boxes probably don't even know about TLS 1.3 properly and they're still locked on TLS 1.2. And so the standard needs to work with all of these things. So what changed when TLS 1.3 came along? We encrypted part of a handshake. So in TLS 1.2, you would see the certificate exchanged, and you could then decode that certificate and see subject alternate names and other stuff in the certificate. This was also considered a risk post Snowden because we knew that people were looking at that stuff. So TLS 1.3 encrypted the certificate, but it left SNI alone because that was just too hard to remove SNI. And they've now come back to this problem afterwards, after getting TLS 1.3 out. And one of the things they did in the latter stages of TLS 1.3 was implement this middle box compatibility mode to make it look like TLS 1.2 on the wire. So often when you do look at a network trace with TLS 1.3, it will often look like a TLS 1.2 session that's been upgraded. And that's very much by design to avoid the boxes realizing what's going on. So these pictures came from Cloudflare. They've done a really good explainer of how this all works. And I've stolen from their images. I've put credits at the bottom. You can see here the client hello and the server hello coming past in the clear. And then you can see we start the encryption. And we can see what that looks like in a real message. Again, another Wireshark trace, and you can see it is very much in the clear despite everything else being encrypted. So let's look at the first attempt at fixing this ESNI. And this was implemented by Cloudflare and Firefox, but pretty much no one else. And they put an extra text record in DNS for the public key. And so before you go to the website, you get this text record back and you go, aha, I know this person speaks ESNI. I'm going to encrypt that piece of SNI information with the public key from the DNS and send it to the provider who's obviously got the private key, can decrypt it, and then knows what certificate to send back. And that kind of worked, but there were real problems implementing this in CDN. There were problems about DNS caching. There were problems about certificate rotation. The standard wasn't very robust and it stuck out too much, which meant the first thing China does is go, aha, if you've got that header going past, I tell you what, I'm just going to block your connection. And so that caused everyone to go back to the drawing board and think about how they could solve this problem again. So attempt 2, encrypted client hello, ECH. So this hides much more information. Instead of just the SNI, it's hiding a load more information from the client hello. And so the ALPN, which is basically what protocol you're using, is it HTTP or is it mail, that's in there, as well as SNI, because again, that's still valuable information on the network. We're using DNS for the public key like we did with ESNI, but we've got a new standard for doing it. And we've got basically an outer hello and then an inner hello, and the outer hello looks like it did before, so the network is unaware of anything's going on, and we've got this new thing, the inner hello, which has got the encrypted information in, and the outer SNI is something that you send to Cloudflare to say, hey, you know, I'm accessing a Cloudflare site or whatever, and so it doesn't actually reveal any information about what you're going to, but it's enough to help with a negotiation. And this makes it much more resilient to traffic analysis, because it's intended to look like a normal HTTPS connection on the wire. You've got a normal looking client outer hello with everything in there, but there's just this extra special inner hello tucked in the middle. So how does this kind of work when you're hosting and you're using something like Cloudflare? The idea is that you've got this idea of an anonymity set. So what you want is lots of people to be sharing the same set of keys, so that you can't say, aha, this was signed by Playboy's keys and therefore they must be going to Playboy. What you kind of want is this anonymity set where loads of people have got exactly the same details in their DNS, and they're all hosted by Cloudflare, and they're all on the same IP address, and they're all sharing the same anonymity set. And so as a network observer, you know it is one of these 10,000 addresses that Cloudflare are hosting within that anonymity set. You want to make it as large as possible. And so it says explicitly in the standard, the client-facing servers, i.e. Cloudflare, should deploy ECH in such a way as to maximize the size of that anonymity set. And so this is not really a standard intended for your corporate network to host their own ECH protected servers, because that kind of defeats the object of it. You're going to your corporate network. This is intended much more for mass hosting of people by Cloudflare on CDNs, which is the modern world in the cloud. So how do I know that the server supports this before I've connected? How do I know what keys to use? So in ESNI, they were using a text record, which is an old-fashioned standard for DNS for appending various bits of information in EUC. Text records used for lots of stuff. They decided that wasn't really flexible enough for what they wanted, and so what we've now got is this new idea of this service binding record in DNS for HTTPS. And so it's KDIG as an example of DIG that supports this, but it only partially supports it because you have to tell it the type. And what you get back is a message that says, ooh, there's some binary data. Okay, what does that actually mean? You can use something like Drill to look into that message. And Drill will tell you that we've got an ALPN of HTTP2, so don't try and talk to me on HTTP 1.1. I want you to talk in HTTP2 directly as binary. We've got an IPv4 hint, so you don't have to go and look it up in the DNS a second time. And we've got an ECH config that's given us our keys. And we've got an IPv6 hint to say that, hey, I can be available on IPv6 if you speak IPv6 as well. So lots of information then for the browser to know how it's going to make the next connection and what it's going to do and bypass some negotiation. And this is good for performance and is good for security. And if that message was exchanged over DOH, the network operator is unaware of this going past. Obviously, if it was exchanged over UDP 53, then the network operator can still see this and mess with it. And you can see the answer in Wireshark. Wireshark already knows how to decrypt these messages as well. So that's kind of interesting. So let's go back to the DO stuff we were talking about before. We said that there was this discovery problem. How do we know what DO server we want to talk to? We've seen how this new ECH standard relies on you having sent the messages via something like DO, because otherwise the thing can still be manipulated. So it's key that we get a good DO connection that's outside the network. So how do we know about this DNS server that's outside our network? And this is the discovery problem. So we've seen hard-coded host names in Firefox. We've seen a hard-coded list of IPs that can be known DOH servers when upgraded, like Chrome and Windows 11. But there are some people thinking about a better standard for doing this that's a bit more portable and a bit more reusable. And this is the discovery of designated resolver standard. And I think as of this week, Cisco have said that their umbrella DNS solution now supports this. No browsers support it yet, but you know, there are some people beginning to support it at the back end. We really need a browser to support this before this is useful, though. But how does this work? So designated resolver. So the resolver, we're assuming this is an encrypted resolver, designated by our local resolver to use in its own place. And this designation could be authenticated by a TLS certificate. So we still don't want to trust the local network. We want the local network to tell us, but we want to verify that the local network is trustworthy. We're not going to just opportunistically upgrade at the moment. And how are we going to do that? So service binding DNS records. So this is a new DNS record, a bit like our HTTPS record, and this is on a special zone, DNS.resolver.ARPA, and you look this up on your local resolver and say, do you know any DO servers? And your local resolver says, I know a DO server, my ISP supports a DO server, it's over here. And it supports HTTP2, and it has this particular query path to send your messages in. And so that's the aim of this standard. But there are some issues. So the standard says, when I make that connection to do.example.net, it needs to have a subject alternate name in the certificate with the unencrypted resolver IP that caused the upgrade. And that's to stop the resolver sending you to something that isn't trusted or somebody else messing in the middle. That precludes your initial connection being on private address space. It means that your DHCP has to have given out a decent public address still. So there are still issues with this standard, but you know, ISPs could change their home routers to start giving out public addresses for their local DNS servers. So it does at least allow you to break the Google Cloudflare kind of monopoly or duopoly on the on providing the large-scale DOH servers. So it is a standard that enables other people to get to DOH, but it still requires some work. There is still the possibility that people could enable opportunistic discovery and say, yeah, even though that server is on a private address, I'm going to trust it to tell me. But at the moment, the standard kind of precludes that. We'll have to see what happens when this really gets adopted. This one's at early stages. There's, like I say, one implementation in the wild and no implementations from the browser vendors. But it's possible that by the time this standard's ratified, it's a bit more flexible and opportunistic discoveries in there. And DHCP can also be the mechanism to send out that service binding message. It doesn't have to have been sent from DNS as a way of sending it out from DHCP as well. But you still need the certificate on the resolver to have the right IP addresses, so it's still hard. So we've looked a lot at how these standards work. So what are the implications for people running networks, like most people on this call? So what can the red team do, or real baddies? Well, you know, user story. As an attacker, I would like to hide my DNS from the blue team. So people have written DO clients, which are C2s, which are exfiltration kits, which use you know, common DO providers like dns.google.com. And so, you know, if you get that bit of software on your workstation and you're allowed a HTTPS connection to dns.google.com, then low, you can send your data via Google, and the corporate network is unaware of what's going on, and it just looks like normal DNS going to google.com. So, so you don't need to be a rocket scientist to set this up. You just need to be able to type git clone and pull down somebody else's kit that already does it. And there's real attacks in the wild that have been used based on I don't know if they were done using a kit or whether they'd written their own, but it's very easy. And yeah, there's the kit go DOH, which is the describing the proof of concept, but in reality, this is good enough for if you've got somebody wanting to play around on the network, they could have a go with it. So are all of these standards good or bad? Well, firstly, this is happening whether we like it or not. Old man can yell at cloud, but it is happening whether we like it or not. And cloud being the operative word here, because it is Cloudflare and Google that are pushing this. Also, different people's threat model are different. So if you're in a restricted network and you've got good reason to want to keep your DNS private because you're you're in China and you don't want to get arrested, this is a very good thing. If you're somebody trying to look after a corporate network and you don't want people to be able to send stuff out of a network without you knowing about it, maybe this is not a good thing. So it really does depend on what your threat model is. Shark is a piece of art in Headington in Oxford. If anyone hasn't seen it, it is a real thing. And obviously the joke being that, the person who built that house wasn't expecting sharks to fall from a roof, but obviously it's an art installation, so they kind of were. So thinking about our, confidentiality, integrity, availability, confidentiality. Who am I being private from? Confidentiality is a bit being private, but are we being private from our parents? Well, this definitely helps you evade parental filtering and be private from your parents. Your ISP probably doesn't care, but yes, you're being private from your ISP. And if your ISP's been asked to implement some blocks by your government, you're being private from your government as well. Your employer, well, if you can get DOH out, you're definitely being private from your employer. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Kind of depends. Are you being private from large American advertising brokers? Yeah, probably not, because you might just be sending your DNS messages to them to decode and do the onward work with. So it kind of depends on who you're sending your DO messages to about whether you're actually improving your privacy, if what you're worried about is large American advertising brokers from snooping on you. So integrity, again, it's the same answer. Who can tamper with my results? You're preventing the first four from tampering with them. But actually, if that large American advertising broker wants to go and put advertising in your results, they can still do it. They don't at the moment, but they could do. And availability. So this is a bit more of a complicated one. So the lack of discovery is ruling out clients using an ISP provided DOH server. So this is tending towards much more centralization. People going to a handful of large providers. There are a lot of small providers out there who've set up their own server, but in reality, 99% of the traffic is going to, the top three. And so what happens when one of those top three has an outage? If Cloudflare has an outage today, maybe you can't get to some Cloudflare websites. If Cloudflare has an outage and you're using them for DNS, well, now you can't get to anything unless you're Firefox is backing off and using something other than Cloudflare. And Cloudflare has had outages. Google has had outages. So it's not unrealistic. And at the moment, my ISP is having an outage because somebody's dug up a fiber and I'm having to use 4G. So, stuff happens, but stuff happens big when it happens wrong at central. When Cloudflare has an outage, it's on the news and everyone knows about it. When Fastly has an outage, it's on the news and everyone knows about it. And this consolidation might not be a good thing for availability. So what about enterprise security? So how are you using some of this information today? Are you using DNS to do malware blocking? Are you using an intrusion prevention system to do malware blocking, but maybe is using SNI to decide whether to inspect stuff? Are you sending your DNS messages to your SIEM to do analysis on and go, ooh, who was looking at that C2 server? I'll go and have a look at their workstation. What about remote workers? Your corporate network workers are using one set of DNS. What DNS are your remote workers using? Are you trying to implement shadow IT controls by looking at what sites people are visiting to say, yeah, that's not a supported cloud storage tool. Please use the supported cloud storage tool. And again, you're losing that visibility potentially. Conditional access, maybe that's using some of that information about where you're coming from, and some of these techniques are spoofing where you're coming from, which might mean that some of your conditional access can get a bit confused with stuff. So there's some consequences for the security. So while the standards are a good thing, they definitely have some implications. And I kind of think about network management as a spectrum. So at one end, you've got unmanaged networks. Well, this doesn't really make any difference to the unmanaged network. They get an upgrade. Your client, he goes into Starbucks and there's no management going on at all. He gets an upgrade potentially, if he's been hard-coded to use Cloudflare because he's no longer using Starbucks. That's a good thing. Your tightly managed enterprise at the other end, they're probably running full TLS interception and a proxy, and they're probably not impacted by this because they're just going to block it because they're running full TLS interception and they can stop all this nonsense and force everyone to use TLS 1.2 and make it all go away. But there's a load of people in the middle who are not one end and they're not the other. So your typical home probably has some DNS filtering going on. If you've got a BT home hub and you're using that to stop the kids from getting to YouTube or turning the internet off at a certain point, your corporate network might be using a firewall with deep packet inspection and IPS, and that might be doing some SNI filtering to stop you going to various things or stop people doing stuff. And those might be used in the smaller enterprise or education networks, which myself and Richard used to work in before, would use that technology quite heavily. So there are some implications for those people in the middle, but their visibility of what goes on in their network gets massively diminished by these standards. And that is not an accident. That is absolutely what the people writing these standards have set out to do, is diminish the network visibility of an observer. And they're not making a difference between the person in the Chinese government and the person in your corporate network. So far as they're concerned, they're equally an unprivileged observer that shouldn't be able to see that traffic. They want to ensure that you're consenting to those controls if you're getting inspected and you're doing the far end with the full TLS interception and you've chosen to accept that certificate. So the solutions to this is basically move the controls onto the clients really rather than the network. So edge software that is doing it. So Microsoft's new Defender endpoint, which is very much happening in the operating system, not in the network. And there's multiple other vendors, again going in the same direction. So much more to do with endpoint rather than network. Network was easy to do because you don't need to write clients for every operating system and all of that stuff. But yeah, it goes away. And yeah, considerations for home networks, parental filtering. Can the kids bypass this? Are you using this in your house? Are you thinking that your kids have protected from going to sites, and actually you find out that the teenagers have worked out how to tick that box and enable DOH and they're way past the BT home hub. And maybe the ISP is providing some of your malware filtering and you're missing out on that as well. And yeah, and we've kind of talked about this, but there's a load of considerations for enterprise networks. You might be using some of these things already. You might be using some of these bits of messages for various bits of security, but you miss out on, or might be now incomplete. I've put a load of further reading up here for anyone who gets the slides afterwards, but yeah, Cloudflare have got a good explainer of this because I've gone pretty 1,000 miles an hour over this, but they do a good job of explaining what they're doing. They don't highlight the bad sides because they are only highlighting the good sides. There's also some NSA CIISec guidance, which basically says, don't let DOE out of your network, do DOE inside your network. You want to keep visibility of who's doing DNS lookups in your network. And that last site, 419 Consulting, there's a load of industry people who joined some calls that are recorded on there for various standards. So if you want to hear some of the industry people discussing this, there's loads of recorded calls, which are kind of interesting. And that's it. Yeah, that's me. So I've gone at 1,000 miles an hour, so I'm guessing there'll be some questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was great. While everybody's kind of taking a minute to kind of absorb what you've just said, because there's a lot there to take in, I've got a couple of questions that I'll ask you. Some things that have sprung to mind as we've been going through that. So just kind of going back to the beginning, and you were talking about the development of the standards and the RFCs, and you were describing who was involved in that process. So do you foresee there to be any opportunity for any members of the public or any organizations to get involved in that process? How can we input into that process if we've got any concerns?
Anyone can join the mailing lists where these being discussed. They're open mailing lists. Anyone can turn up to the IETF meetings if they pay the 50 quid or whatever it is to turn up to the meetings. They used to be free when the meetings were in person, and they would charge for in person, and anyone could join online. Now that they're mostly online, to make the money back for that, they're charging a nominal fee for joining the conferences. But yeah, so people can join, they can put their hand up, they can go and talk. In general, the audience, if somebody goes in there and starts talking about wanting to block things and wanting to do censorship, is pretty hostile. It's like turning up to a fossil fuels convention and wanting to talk about solar panels. It's a difficult message to get through, because the people are very much heading in the other direction. And yeah, I've seen some quite hostile responses to some of this stuff from some people, quite vocal in both directions. But at the moment, the people who want to prevent censorship have the whip hand in those meetings.
Mm. So again, I guess it's development of the open and free internet, but the larger players who've got the loudest voices are still the cloud providers.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and the people really missing the voices are people like, I suspect a lot of people on this call are, small corporate IT who probably want nothing to change. Yeah, those are the people whose voices really aren't very present in those calls. And if they do speak up, it tends to then get like a volley of stuff headed back at them.
So it's a brave person that joins in with that.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and just kind of rounding that off, I guess, is what hope is there if we don't want to use Cloudflare or Google? What if we don't want to share data about where we're visiting with people who are out to make money from monetizing what we're doing? So, if we want to use Linux and Firefox, but we're kind of strapped, how can we resolve that?
There are pretty good lists of DOH providers out there, so you can pick another DOH provider from a list. But and some of them implement malware blocking, some of them implement family filtering, and so if you want to set it up in your house, you could implement one of the ones that does the family filtering and the malware blocking and doesn't sell the data. Quad9 being a good example of that. Some of them are run by non-profits and definitely are not selling the data. Cloudflare claimed not to be restoring and saving the data, but I suspect that if you look at the wording, they probably are allowed to do aggregate statistics off it and still learn stuff on machine learning over it, but they're not keeping a good record for the police still. Yeah, so there's definitely ways that you can configure your own server and send it to somewhere. If you're running a network, you can choose where to send it. The issue is more, how do you prevent people from sending it? So Peter's put how would you not let DOH out of your network? And the answer basically is not let HTTPS out of your network. send it through a proxy and inspect every single thing going through the proxy. If you've got a proxy and you're doing that, you probably can prevent DOH if you know the complete list of DOH servers on the internet, which is obviously ever expanding. If you're doing TLS interception on everything, then you could definitely block it, because you can spot the exact messages go past and knock them on the head, even if it's a DOS server you don't know about. But not everyone wants to do TLS interception on everything, because that's a massive privacy invasion on your staff, because you accidentally start doing TLS interception on their banking details and their health details, and you kind of only want to do TLS interception on things you don't understand, and so it's hard. And yes, as Peter says, yeah, there is a cost implication of doing TLS interception on everything, not least managing certificate distribution, which is a pain in the neck, even if you ignore the hardware implications of it.
Okay, so you talked about how Microsoft were introducing some capability to configure Windows 11. So given that it's a browser-based standard, why do we care what the operating system is doing?
I guess because if you're in Starbucks and you've taken your Windows 11 laptop into Starbucks, Chrome may have been configured to use Cloudflare or whoever, and you're sending your DNS that way, but you're still sending some information from the operating system out for the regular DNS. It's quite chatty, and so by implementing an operating system, it's stopping all of that stuff going out and being sniffed locally. There might still be enough information to identify your machine in that messages that you're sending out, and so you're stopping that privacy information leaking to Starbucks' network operator. So there is an advantage to doing it. There's just a slight complication that you could end up with the operating system sending its DOH one way, the browser choosing to send its DOH somewhere else, and you end up with again complicated diagnostics going on. That's less of an issue in the corporate network, because in the corporate network you're probably going to hard code it in we're just using the AD. But from home, maybe you end up with some more complicated scenarios, and you think the thing that's doing the browsing is doing the DNS, but actually it's something else.
Okay, so interesting times. So we haven't got any more questions. I presume that's because the immense amount of detail that you included in your presentation, which was great. So,
or I've confused everyone.
So just to remind everybody that the webinar has been recorded. So if you want to go back and listen to it again, might need to go back and listen to it a few times, and tell your colleagues to go and listen to it. If they're CIISec members, they'll be able to follow the recording as well.
Yeah, and if people are interested in these standards, like I say, the Cloudflare links at the end are really good and do explain in really good detail how it works. You just have to read them with a view that these people only are seeing the good side of it, and they're not highlighting any of the issues. So they explain really well how it works, but you kind of have to view it through that lens.
Okay, so that kind of leads us to the end of the presentation. There we go. Just fighting with the Zoom controls. So just leaves me to thank Paul very much for the a fantastically detailed and really interesting talk this afternoon. It was really good of you to give your time to go through that with us. So you can catch up with Paul on LinkedIn or Twitter if you've got any more questions around this subject. You can email events at CIISec.org if you've got any questions about any of the other events. If you missed the beginning, I gave a list of upcoming webinars, so do go and have a look at the LinkedIn page for CIISec or the CIISec website. So Paul, thank you very much, and I can see lots of praise and thank yous in the chat as well. So echoing my comments. So thank you very much, Paul, and we'll end it there. So thank you, everybody.
Cool. Thank you for listening.